Well, good morning, good morning, good morning. Barry Jones, SP History, continuing with our series, The Formation of the Deep State. In fact, this is chapter 25. This will be the last episode in part one, having completed the formation and of the deep state as we know it or knew it during World War II and in the Cold War period, which was, as I defined it, the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, the deep state will continue to evolve after the Cold War and the war on terror, which we are currently still engaged in. But there's been an evolution during my lifetime where it's turned into the federal bureaucracy and all the industries that feed it. But during the period that we're speaking about, World War II, the Cold War up to the 70s, I'm going through the covert operations of the 50s, where the deep state basically sets its own foreign policy, doesn't matter what the president wants or thinks. And then the assassinations of the 60s and then Watergate 70s. That's sort of the timeline for this series, Treasonous Cabal. If you were to go forward, uh, it would be more the federal bureaucracy and all the industries that feed it. But this is a dispensation that I have focused on that the deep state is interested in making as much money as possible. And they have found, as a result of two world wars, that continuous warfare is the most lucrative uh, business model ever been created. Now, since then, the federal bureaucracy has gotten into the act and they've discovered other ways to make money and creating other national or worldwide emergencies involved in health, and other things. But uh, I'm focusing on this period. So the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. What we did yesterday in chapter 24 was look at the individuals that FDR invited in to help run the war effort and their connections to private sector industry. Of course, with them comes the ultra vires doctrine, which transforms the government from a government of the people, by the people, for the people, into a government doing the same thing, interested in the same thing, uh, operating under the same mandate as the private sector corporations, which is now, instead of representing the people, what's best for the public interest, it's now all about profits. And the people or the public interest doesn't matter. And of course, along the way, they give themselves immunity so they're not liable for any of their actions. And we've seen that over and over, and it continues to this day. So today, what I want to look at is the corporate profits that were made. We did a similar thing after sort of itemized all the corporate profits after World War One, and we're going to do the same thing in World War Two. So corporate profits, there was no NIE committee like there was after World War One, which you know went through and added up all the profits of all the different industries and came to a conclusion based on documented evidence that there are conservative estimates by the United States Department of Commerce. The profits of all U.S. corporations after taxes in 41 were 8.5 billion. Now this is 19. This is dated data. So in today's dollars, it'd be much more. 8.7 billion in 42, 9.8 billion in 43, and 9.9 billion in 1944. This is after taxes. So this is after their expenses. This is a huge profit. You can see here in this graph the profits, how they rose during these war years significantly. There was a little dip in 45 when the war ended. And then boom, when the Cold War kicked into high gear, look at the profits again. So any wonder why we are always at war with somebody? Um, in 44, the profits were more than twice as large as 1939. So if you're measuring or juxtaposing before the war versus during the war and doing a comparison analysis, in 1944, the profits were twice as large. So we already established that the profits in 1944 were 9.9 billion, about 10 billion. So that means in 1939, the profits were 5 billion. So the war made a big difference. That's a huge increase. In 1944, profits were 3 billion higher than in 1929, the greatest year of, at the height of the roaring 20s, when everything was going well. The profits were still only 7 billion as compared to 10 billion. That I don't I cannot overstate the importance or significance of this because technically we're still in a Great Depression, right? Uh, 1929, we were not in a Great Depression. We were in the height of the Roaring 20s. So you are comparing apples and oranges, essentially. Great Depression economy versus and a wartime economy versus the Roaring 20s. 10 years of these big corporate presidents. Business of America is business, Calvin Coolidge. 10 years of deregulation, 10 years of uh, cutting taxes, 10 years of economic stimulus to promote business growth. And yet, at the height of the roaring 20s economy, profits of these corporations were still $3 billion less than they were, not because of the Great Depression, in spite of the Great Depression, all because of the war. All because of the war. So the war overcame the headwinds of the Great Depression and still plowed past that $7 billion threshold and went $3 billion further. I mean, there's just not another economic stimulus that compares to war. 47 iron and steel corporations made net profits after taxes in 39, which is before we get into the war, $146 million. Okay. 2 years later, we're just starting to mobilize and get into the war because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. $325 million. And 3 years later, it's still 194 million. You can see that iron and steel was impacted most at the beginning in the mobilization period of the war. And here's a map of all the different increases in capacity of steel, the steel industry. You can see where these places are. You can see a big portion of them in the Northeast, also in the Midwest there around Lake Michigan. That's a huge economic impact. But 41 especially, that's iron and steel. How about automobiles? 15, I always believed, when I was taught in history class, that they shut down all the automobile plants. They started making planes and tanks. It's not true. 15 automobile companies made profits of 223 million in 1939, 274 million in 1941, and 222 million in 1944. Now, here's what they did. They did retrofit, and they did get big government contracts to make the planes and the tanks. And those government contracts were equal to, and actually in 1941, they were greater than the profits they were making their primary product, which was automobiles. They made more money during the war making tanks and planes than they did prior to the war making cars. So if you're Henry Ford or if you're uh, your GM, whichever, uh, you're not hurting. Everybody builds them up like they did this great act of patriotism to switch from building cars to their profits still went up. So it wasn't the great act of patriotism we've been led to believe. And they still made some cars along the way as well. But uh, mostly they were engaged in wartime production, and they saw no uh, drawback to it. It was business as usual. They continued to make the same amount of money they were making prior. So that's automobiles. Uh, how about manufacturing goods, or beverages or tobacco? In 1939, the profits were 151 million, jumps 8 million up to 159 million in 1941. And in 1944, it jumps all the way up to 175 million. And food is one of these items that you have to continue to transport and provide for your allies, especially as the war drags on. Their food making or food growing capabilities decreased over time. But that was also true of other manufactured goods. We were the country that could manufacture. The other countries, our allies, could not. So that particular profit margin continued to grow as the war went along. So that's a significant increase. How about railroads? Railroads who are transporting all these manufactured goods to ports are making huge profits. You can see by this advertisement, we have no time to lose. And there's a sense of urgency to keep the trains rolling because the railroads are, quote, the backbone of the offense. It's what keeps all these weapons, but also troops transported to the ports, transported to the front lines, but also food and manufactured goods, weapons, munitions, et cetera, et cetera. So all of a sudden, trains, it became patriotic to support railroads because they were the ones getting all this uh, these manufactured goods to the necessary ports to get them to Europe. $93 million profit in 1939. Look at the increase. 902 million in 1942 and 668 million in 1944. Yeah, that's astounding, right? They're doing okay in 39, but look what they did in 42 and 44. The war was kinder to the railroad industry than any other industry. And that's saying something because it was kind to all these industries. GM's total sales nearly tripled between 1939 and 43. In fact, if you listed the 15 men in the country who had the highest paid GM execs, had six of them. So you just take a list of the 15 richest men. It wouldn't be the richest men, but the ones who had the highest pay. GM had six of the 15. At the end of 44, GM had $169 million in cash and $428 million in government securities, which means they bought a lot of war bonds, and the government owed GM a lot of money. So GM's doing very, very well. U.S. Steel income before taxes in 39 was 65 million. In 41 it was 272 million. So you're talking about almost a fourth, over a fourth, almost five-fold increase. That's unbelievable. 261 million in 1942. Earned surplus of company rose from 263 million in 1939 to 377 million in 1944. So U.S. Steel is doing very well. How about the aluminum company of America's most oftentimes referred to as Alcoa Aluminum? This is right outside Knoxville, Tennessee. The operating income increased from 53 million in 1939. All of a sudden, they need planes, and planes are made out of aluminum. So, boom, in 1943, their income raised to 185 million and 153 million in 1944. And we're going to find out something interesting about all these companies later on. But they're not just selling to us. Just a little hint to what's coming. But so Alcoa Aluminum is doing very well. General Electric profits rose from 51 million in 39 to 253 million in 43 and settled at 195 million in 1944. So the high water mark for most of these companies seems to be right smack in the middle of the war, 42, 43, and then it settles slightly in 1944. And 1945 drops a little bit more because the war ends, which is why the Cold War was necessary. DuPont, chemicals, synthetics. DuPont had a 23% interest in GM. So we know because of what we already learned about GM, its interest in GM is benefiting DuPont. But apart from that, its own net operating income grew from 67 million in 39 to 160 million in 1944. And its corporate surplus grew from 256 million in 39 to 366 million in 1944. Unbelievable. All right, here's what I said is interesting about some of these companies. These are American companies that are aiding and abetting the enemy. They're doing business with the enemy. This is why Allen Dulles was necessary. This is why Operation Sunrise was necessary. If you don't remember what that was about, I did a whole video, a couple videos actually, on Allen Dulles. And he was the Swiss director of U.S. intelligence during the war. But that was one hat. The hat that mattered most was he was the lawyer that represented all his clients, Becker, Sullivan, Cromwell. These are these businesses that did business with Germany prior to the war, but also, very scandalous, during the war. And they were worried that they would be held liable, or it would be a terrible PR disaster for them when the American people found out that they'd been aiding and abetting, committing treason, essentially, against its own country by doing business with the enemy. And they wanted they wanted that hidden. And so enter Allen Dulles, who's in a strategic location to negotiate a secret peace with these German Nazis in Italy, and to negotiate and immunize some of these war criminals so that they could help or assist in the protection of the assets of these companies as the war wound down, but also keep them as far away from the Nuremberg war crimes trials as possible so they could help us in the new Cold War against the Soviets. It was all an effort to benefit A, his clients, and B, U.S. intelligence after the war, which he knew he was going to be in charge of. It was very self-serving. So these are companies, and this is just a partial list. Okay, I'm not going we'd be here all day if I went through the entire list. Chase Manhattan, which later became J.P. Morgan Chase. And we've already learned that was one of that was the home base, basically, of a plot against FDR in 32 and 33. Remember, Robert Clark worked for J.P. Morgan. All these guys came from J.P. Morgan. So they're committing treason here at home. They're also committing treason abroad, profiting in all these business relationships with the Nazis. On one transaction alone, they made a $500,000 profit. Specifically, what was their task? It's a bank. They were targeting Jewish bank accounts, freezing their assets, making it possible for the German government, the Nazis, to steal all the wealth of the Jews. And, you need people in banking to facilitate that. J.P. Morgan was facilitating that. The Rockefeller Foundation was funding Nazi eugenics research, which isn't a big surprise because the Rockefellers were heavily involved in eugenics here at home. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but what the Nazis learned about eugenics, they learned from us. We were doing it in the 20s. Hitler did it in the 30s. Now, he took it to an extreme, but an argument could be made that everything he knew about eugenics and creating a master race came from American science. And that's why the Rockefeller Foundation was so instrumental in helping the Nazis learn eugenics. But of course, that would be very scandalous, especially when the extent of the Holocaust was revealed, to understand that the Rockefellers were involved, that J.P. Morgan was involved, helping steal all the wealth from these Jews. And yet that's exactly what was happening. Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford was so tight with Adolf Hitler that his portrait hung in Hitler's office. They were that tight. Ford Motor Company used enslaved Russians from the Eastern Front in its factories. So they got, Ford obviously did something for Hitler, and so Hitler returned a favor by providing Ford cheap labor, free labor, basically. Dow Chemical supplied chemicals for the Nazis and their ABC weapons program. A stood for atomic, B stood for biological, and C stood for chemicals. And the chemicals that they were using and putting into these, they were using gas in World War One. They accelerated their program in World War II. After the war, we found big storehouses full of these rockets that had attached to them these gas canisters that they never fired at the British. There's always a lot of questions. I did a paper on this in college. Why didn't Hitler fire the gas? He had the capability to. And he had the V-1 rockets, which later became the V-2 rockets. They're unmanned. You could just shoot them off and they would explode. Gas, But there's some people who speculate, well, he himself was the victim of a gas attack in World War One, blinded him temporarily. He was so horrified by that. He just didn't want to use gas unless it was a weapon of last resort. He really wanted the atomic program to get up to speed fast enough to make the difference in the war. But there were a lot of chemical weapons or agents that he had at his disposal. And of course, we all know he used some of them against Jews, right? He gassed them. That's how he killed them. That was the final solution. But to the extent that he could have, he didn't use them in war as much as he could have. and it could have been just a disaster for the Allies. But he had them at his disposal, and Dow Chemical helped supply him with those necessary chemicals. My goodness. How about Coca-Cola? I didn't. I always wondered what this Fanta was, where it came from. Coca-Cola rebranded its drink, its product in Germany, called it Fanta during the war, so as to distinguish between Coca-Cola and Fanta. Guys like me grow up not realizing Fanta was actually Coca-Cola that was sold in Germany during the war. And to continue selling it to German consumers during the war, they just changed the name so American people didn't realize it was the same company. Woolworth fired all of its Jewish workers and was considered an honorary Aryan seller by the Reich. In other words, this was pressure applied, and if you're going to do business in Germany, you got to fire all your Jews. Woolworths went along with it and made the most favored list, honorary Aryan seller by the Reich. And how about MGM? MGM was a provider of films for German audiences, and those audiences made up a huge portion of their profit and their business during the war. So MGM's doing business with the enemy. Kodak hid operations in Germany under numerous subsidiaries, trying to prevent the public from finding out they're still doing business in Germany. They sold photographic and electronic equipment to the Nazis to aid their war effort. So, the Nazis, they whatever film or electronic equipment that they had that was, you know, take, filming footage of maybe spies or whatever. I don't even know what they would do, what they would use it for, but obviously for intelligence purposes, possibly. Kodak developed all their film and sold the equipment that they would need to develop their film, to get this footage, to film whatever it is that they're trying to film. And of course, the Nazis documented everything. In fact, it was interesting. If you do a study on the war crimes tribunals, a lot of the evidence presented against these war criminals was their own. We found big storehouses of reels, film reels, where they filmed these terrible experiments that were conducted in these concentration camps against Jewish prisoners. They filmed it. They filmed the concentration camp, the gas chambers, they filmed the crematoriums. They filmed the SS going in ahead of the behind the army, rounding up the Jews, shooting them, and throwing them into big open earth graves. They filmed all this, and of course Kodak sold them all this equipment to do all that. So, and Kodak, we already learned how corporations hide or immunize themselves by hiding their assets or hiding their incomes. And the way they do that is they create subsidiaries or shell companies or holding companies. It's just a whole myriad of companies that seemingly are unrelated to the mother company, but they're all related to the mother company. They're all run by the same person. They're all part of the same company. That's what Kodak did. How about General Electric? General Electric worked closely with Krupp, which was a German manufacturing company, and Krupp used Jewish slave labor to build the gas chambers that would later kill all the Jews in the concentration camps. And General Electric was helping build those gas chambers. They profited $1.5 million from its partnership with Krupp during the war. Of course, they had other partnerships as well. So all of these American companies are turning a blind eye to what's going on in Germany during the war. No, this is why Americans cannot say they didn't know about the Holocaust and can't claim ignorance. You add that into, what Alan Dulles, I did a whole episode on what these 3 different times people came to Alan Dulles, director of U.S. intelligence during the war, the Swiss director, with documented evidence, sometimes pictures, their own stories, documents, everything of what was going on in these concentration camps. And he ignored all, he buried all of it. How about the big ship that came into harbor? FDR forbade them from stopping and dropping off all the Jewish refugees, made them go back to Germany where they were killed. I mean, and now you got all these American companies participating in the Holocaust, essentially, is what they're doing. So Americans have blood on their hands. The Holocaust has our blood on our hands as well. Aiding and abetting the enemy. Continue. How about Alcoa Aluminum? Already talked about how much money they made during the war. They had another company in Germany, the equivalent called Kaiser Aluminum. It was owned by Alcoa. They exported massive quantities of aluminum to Germany before and during the war, so much that it created an aluminum shortage back here at home. So it again, public interest doesn't. They don't care who wins the war, evidently. Uh, it's all about making money. It's all about profit. It doesn't matter who our customers are, good guys, bad guys. Doesn't matter how it affects our war effort going forward. Matter profits. That's all that matters. IBM. IBM, through its German subsidiary, again, they created an offshoot with a different name, supplied information technology and methods to the Nazis so they could track all the Jews and log their information, labeling them as undesirables and basically putting the stink of, it's kind of like digital ID today. There's this big argument in Europe right now, and I'm sure it'll end up here as well. Digital ID, where the government can track every movement you make and and actually control you through digitally. They can control your credit card transactions. They control if you get gas for your car. They can control your car. It's an electric car. They can control if you're allowed to travel. All they got to do is shut down your bank accounts or shut down, you know, uh, your passport or and basically ground you to your house if you don't have the right social credit score. This is what IBM was doing back in the 40s in Germany. Here's all the Jews. Here's information technology. Let's figure out a way to track all these people. They provided essential services and routing Jewish populations to concentration camps. So they were masters of efficiency. We give all this credit to the Nazis, talking about the final solution, how efficient they were. Well, the reason they were efficient is because they were getting all this advice and counsel, and they had business relationships with all these American companies who themselves had mastered the art of efficiency back home in their effort to maximize profits. They just applied what they learned back at home and they applied it to the war effort. I told you yesterday that I would define this new kind of government. I told you it's not a democracy. It's what we call plutocracy. It's an oligarchy where society is ruled by a few wealthy individuals, as you see in this cartoon. You see the candidate out front. He's just a puppet. He's a hand puppet. He's a sock puppet, right? And the guy behind him has got his hand in, and he's controlling what the puppet says, what the puppet does. But the power behind the throne is the rich guy. A few wealthy individuals. Go back to what I said about FDR. He called it. He predicted it when he was running for president the first time in 32. Wrote about in his book. He says we are headed toward. Now he called it an oligarchy of despots, and he said, we're headed to a society that's going to be ruled by 100 wealthy individuals, and and it's an oligarchy politically, economically, in every way, and that's where we are. In a plutocratic system, the wealthy exert these elites. They exert significant influence over all the political decisions, and everything flows from that. And of course, this is at the expense of democracy and equality. They don't care about the public interest. This is why I've made such a big point about ultra vires in the private sector inserting itself into the public sector. They've always operated this way in the private sector. This is why unions sprung up. This is why strikes happened. This is why labor became, you got into this adversarial relationship between the people, the employees, the labor supply, and the owners. Because if left to their own devices, the owners will always exploit their workers. Now, extrapolate that out, and now ultravirus has made it into the government, and now that means government, in conjunction with these owners, these plutocrats, are going to now do the same thing. They're going to exploit the people instead of being a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Now it's a government against the people. In conjunction, it's really a government of the plutocrats or the owners or the deep state, however you want to call it, of the deep state, by the deep state, for the deep state, at the expense of the public interest. That's why it matters about the private sector getting invited in during World War I by Wilson and get invited in again during World War II by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And as I mentioned, it's not. I don't think these plutocrats came into government thinking, Hey, this is our chance to screw the people. They just came in and did what they always do. And the government is the one that changed. These plutocrats came in, operated exactly as they always do. The government changed and adopted their operating principle. And that is why we are today a plutocracy. And that's why I saw an estimate yesterday. We talk about the presidential campaigns and how expensive they are. It's not just presidential campaigns. I was listening to a report yesterday that said that the governor's race in New Jersey, which is hotly contested right now, the estimate is it's going to cost $500 million on each side to run one off against the other. That's $1 billion campaign for a governor's race. Imagine how much it's going to cost for the next presidential campaign. Who has that money? The plutocrats. We don't have it. We might, small donations, $5, $10, $20, but that they can't run a campaign on $5, $10, $20 campaign donations unless you get billions of them. You need the money from these plutocrats. So again, they exercise or exert significant influence of the political process. No kidding, right? That's a plutocracy. So what have we learned? In this road to this plutocracy, we have, if you go through, this is all the time periods we've covered in different dispensations. In the post-Civil War era, we had the rise of corporations, and that brought with it the rise of the ultravirus doctrine. Now, that was in the private sector, right? And you had these people were called robber barons, they were called captains of industry. However, your perspective, that's when it started, post-Civil War. And then these robber barons slash captains of industries decided, well, if we're going to continue on this capitalist journey to making more and more money every year, we need more territory. We need foreign territory. We need to imperialize like all these other countries around the world are. If not us, it's going to be somebody else, and we'll be their targets. Social Darwinism. We need the foreign territory for cheap resources. We need the foreign territory for more markets. We need the foreign territory for the land itself. We need the foreign territory to build military bases on to enforce our empire. And of course, it's this social Darwinist race between us and others. And if we don't do it, somebody else will, and we'll be their victims. So they gin up, at first they basically, bought Alaska legitimately. Then they stole Hawaii illegitimately. Then they wanted Cuba. And so they gin up the Spanish-American War. We get as a result all these colonies. We get Puerto Rico, we get Guam, we get Wake Island, we get the Philippines, we get basically sovereignty over Cuba. And wow, it was a splendid little war. It worked so well. And all these goodies we got sugar cane down in Cuba. We got a military base down in Cuba. We got a military base in the Philippines, which now gives us access to China. I mean, this is like this, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of all that, we have an election in 1900, and that's where the American people get to make a choice. Do we want to continue on this imperialist journey, which is basically at the behest of these robber barons slash captains of industry? Now they're called imperialists or colonizers, but it's the same people. They're the ones who want to continue down this road. So you have two parties, one saying yes, the other saying no, and the people chose yes. So here we had a choice to go back to our isolationist past, the tradition of George Washington. We leave others alone if they leave us alone. Instead, we chose, the American people chose, which gave these emerging plutocrats permission. It gave them a mandate to continue to do this, to continue to operate this way. Now, there was some blowback. The power elites ran into a progressive movement. We call it the progressive era. It started at Lake Chautauqua. We talked about that, where uh, a church, ironically, American religious leaders said, "Hey, this is not right. What we're doing. This is not right the way we're treating our own people. It's certainly not right the way we're treating indigenous peoples in other countries around the world. This is not right." And so they started teaching the Sunday school kids and the public school kids and all these kids, and they enacted certain reforms here at home, like women got the right to vote, prohibition, the income tax, which was a progressive tax, higher tax on higher incomes, all these different reforms, right? Public education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that didn't change the overall direction, because the overall direction, our presidents, we had progressive presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, like William Howard Taft, like Woodrow Wilson. Those are three very progressive presidents who still uh, enlarged our foreign empire. Even while at home, they're enacting all these progressive reforms. They're still enlarging our foreign empire, giving these power elites what they wanted. And then you get to World War One. And at this point, Woodrow Wilson, who campaigned on a promise not to ever use the military, actually did three times: Haiti, Mexico, and eventually World War One. And during this war, which he considered to be an existential crisis, he invited the quote best and brightest. It's these same plutocrats, the power elites, the imperialists, the robber barons, it's the same people. These get called different things. He invites them in to help run the war effort. I gave you three of the names: Bernard Baruch, Herbert Hoover, and George Creel. And and this is the second example of these plutocrats who want these wars, to first in the Spanish American War to create an empire, and then in World War One to protect the empire. And they're using the same methods to do it. They're propagandizing the American people, lying to them, building up the enemy, creating a boogeyman. Then they're manufacturing evidence in the form of a Spanish ambassador letter or a Zimmerman note, and then they launch these false flag attacks. The USS Maine, the USS Lusitania. And boom, next thing you know, in these wars, these foreign wars, we got 100 years, hadn't fought any foreign wars. And all of a sudden, we fought two back to back. And these best and brightest bring with them this maximize profits, public interest be damned, immunize yourself, ultra vires. They bring with them this operating principle from the private sector right into the public sector, and they get invited in by Woodrow Wilson. Now, when the war ends, they realize as they do inventory, wow, we made a lot of money during the war. Next time we have one of these, we can't let it end. It has to go on interminably, because it's the best business model that's ever been created. War. We make all this money, and I've gone through the statistics, shown you the data. We make all this money prior to the war, but then when we get into the war, we make double, triple, quadruple. The and it was in World War One and World War Two. So the common theme is, the common denominator is war. That's when we make our biggest profits. So the decision was made, we can't let this end next time we have a war. And in the interwar years, they collaborated. They thought, well, if there's money to be made in war where we're breaking stuff, there's got to be money made after the war when we rebuild all the stuff. So that's when we got into business with Germany, rebuilding Germany. And in these interwar periods, we talked about the two entities that helped make that possible. The Brown Brothers Harriman, which was that investment bank in New York. Prescott Bush was involved with that. And all these big industries getting these contracts and helping and sending money into Germany to help finance Germany's rearmament, which is a complete violation of the Treaty of Versailles, right? Help finance Hitler's rise to power, help rebuild Germany after a disastrous World War One. And we've, you know, Sullivan and Cromwell, with the Dulles brothers, helping facilitate all these business collaborations between our companies and the German companies, the Nazi Party. And then, right during that interwar period, our country went full bore into plutocracy. We voted in three straight presidents who were basically right straight out of central casting, these robber barons, these captains of industry. It was Harding, it was Coolidge, and it was Hoover. And so the Roaring Twenties, this interwar period, was an example of a decade in American history where the plutocrats literally had their hands on all the levers of power. They were in the White House. They were doing business with the enemy. Well, it wasn't our enemy technically at that time, but we were doing business with what was going to be our enemy. And we've come through two wars, one to create an empire, the next to preserve that empire, to protect it. And now those people that used to be on the outside looking in, paying money to politicians to do their bidding, are now on the inside with their hands right on the levers of power. That brings us to World War II. And course, because of the crash and the economic fallout and Hoover's inability to solve the Great Depression, the nation shifts back to a progressive president, World War II. But what is the irony of this most progressive president we ever had? He invites in more people from this private sector plutocracy than ever before, gives them all the levers of power, access to all the levers of power, and says, run the war effort. And we just went through who they were. We just went through the companies they represented, how much money their own companies made during this war effort. I gave you executives from GE. GE made huge profits. I gave you executives from US Steel. US Steel made huge profits. I gave you executives from GM. GM made huge profits. Ford Motor Company. I could go on and on and on. These are all the people in the war effort that are also simultaneously helping their own companies. It goes back to those phrases during World War One: profiteering, merchants of death, right? Because war is making them money. That's the road to plutocracy that we've taken. And it wasn't always treason. Started off as treachery. The private sector ultra buyers was, exploitation, but it wasn't illegal. The securing of the foreign territories, Hawaii, it wasn't treason. It certainly wasn't benevolent, but it wasn't illegal. The securing of Panama Canal, we had to engage in some treachery to bluff the Colombians with our navy, etc. And we got access to the land to build the Panama Canal. It wasn't treasonous. It wasn't illegal, but it wasn't benevolent. Certainly charitable. Same thing with China, the open door north, forcing our way into the Far East, telling the Chinese, hey, we're here, we're on your side. No, we just wanted their markets. We wanted their resources from Manchuria. And we, we were able to play the role of the good guy because the other colonizing powers had treated them so poorly. So we came in on the white horse, but really uh, it was about increasing our foreign markets and creating a sphere of influence in the Far East and getting access to resources, et cetera. Where it got into treason was when we propagandized the American people into the Spanish-American War, where we manufactured evidence and created a false flag situation to betray the American people into a war whereby American citizens died. That's treason. We did the same thing in World War I. Propaganda again. Remember, we worked with Britain this time. Britain cut the transatlantic cable. All the information from England came filtered through Britain, and we played along. And so then we manufactured the evidence of the Zimmerman note. We didn't do it; the British did, but we were their ally. They were working with us. We were working with them. They wanted us in the war. We wanted in the war because we needed a seat at the peace table. And then the false flag was the Lusitania. We just innocently put an American flag on a British ship. We just innocently loaded it full of American citizens. We just innocently put contraband in it, sailed it right into the path of the German subs, and acted all surprised when it got sunk. Oh, gee. And then that's treason. Betraying American people into another war whereby American citizens die. It's treason. How about the business plot? That was the same plutocrats who didn't like the fact that he took us off the gold standard and their fortunes were at stake. They didn't like the fact that he was going to spend wildly on the New Deal, which was going to detract from their business arrangement. And so they plotted to overthrow his government. We spent 2 days on that. How about World War II? Same deal. To expand our empire this time, we used propaganda again. They cut the transatlantic cable. All the word coming over was filtered through England, our chief ally. They suppressed the evidence this time in order to lure the Japanese into the trap of Pearl Harbor. We didn't reveal to them we'd broken their code. We didn't reveal to them we knew everything they were up to. We knew, and every time we added something more to the boycott list or to the list of items that they couldn't buy from us, we knew it was aggravating them more. We pushed them into a corner so they would attack us at Pearl Harbor. And since they were allied with Germany, that would give us the excuse to go help Britain in the war against Germany. Pearl Harbor was a false flag. And that's another betrayal of the American people into a war where American citizens died. That's treason. And then during the war, we see numerous instances where American companies owned by these same plutocrats are helping run the war effort here at home are still doing business with our enemy, aiding and abetting the enemy. That's treason. Alan Dulles' secret surrender. That's treason. Acting, you know, he was insubordinate to his commander in chief, negotiated a secret surrender with the German Nazis. Same thing with Operation Sunrise, all in an effort to protect his clients, his Sullivan and Cromwell clients, who wanted to protect their assets and the fact they were doing business with our enemy during the war, before the war and during the war, and wanted to continue after the war. So you see the road from treachery to treason. Um, how about the business models? What have we learned about the business model? Well, it started off, the business models was, the rise of corporations. Corporations operate. They try to minimize their costs, their labor costs, their raw materials, and then make as big a profit as possible. And that's what they did. Well, then when private and public mixed, and you get into imperialism, where government is now doing acting at the behest of the private industry, ginning up a war with the Spanish-American War on behalf of the sugar companies that wanted their hands on Cuba, on behalf of the investors who wanted access to China, right? They wanted these cheap raw materials, cheap labor, export. So our government went to war on behalf of these plutocrats. Same thing in World War One, where these plutocrats participated in the mobilization, profiteering, becoming merchants of death, making huge sums of money. Again, the U.S. government, in order to protect that empire that they created during the Spanish-American War, are now going to war. Officially, it's a government action. It's a public sector action on behalf of the private sector. After World War One, we had the post-war or interwar period where government permitted the loans and investment in Germany, even though it technically violated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The Dawes Plan, that was a law passed by our government that would benefit U.S. banks. You remember the Dawes Plan? U.S. banks would loan money to Germany. Germany would take the money at interest, pay their reparations debt to Germany, to France and England. France and England take that same money with interest and pay back America the loans that they had taken out during the war. So U.S. money ended up back in U.S. banks, plus interest from Germany, France, and England. It was a scam. And the U.S. government passed a law that made it possible for that to happen. Again, public interest or public sector working together with private sector as partners. And then you get into World War II, and now, because of the lesson we learned in World War One, we're not going to let World War II end. And you see, we talked about Alan Dulles, how he was already ginning up, stoking all of the passion that was going to be necessary to transition from World War II right into the Cold War. An old ally becoming a new enemy, the Soviets. That was already being laid. The groundwork was being laid so that World War II transitioned right into a Cold War, and we'd have to stay at a war footing or a constant state of readiness so that all this money that's been coming in through these wars will continue to be made in the post-war period. There would be no such thing as a post-war period anymore. Or just transition from one war to the next. Continuous warfare. That's the new business model. So the old business models, corporations in the private sector, minimize their costs, maximize their profits. An argument can be made that the new business model is the exact same. Minimize your costs, maximize your profits. How do you do that in the public sector? You create an empire where you exploit the indigenous people and take all their resources. You create wars where you create customers and markets for your goods, and you never let those end so you can maximize your profits. And you do it during war, during interwar periods, but then you continue this war interminably so that the business model just goes on without any pause. So you see what ultra-virus has done. The minimize costs, maximize profits, public interest be damned that used to be exclusively in the private sector has now fully immersed itself, enmeshed itself in the public sector. And the policy flows from that. So what do we end up with? We end up with a situation that looks like this. This is kind of a drawing for a diagram of what Eisenhower will later call the military-industrial congressional complex. And you see at the top, the congressmen, these are the guys that vote in all the money, right? They serve on different armed services committee, and they vote spendings or appropriations bills, which creates the contracts for these defense contractors, right? And these defense contractors then produce all the weapons or whatever it is that they're contracted to manufacture. And then they take a portion of their profits, which are stupendously high, and some of it they send to the campaign contributions of the next campaign cycle. Some of it they send to TV, radio, newspapers to control corporate control of the media, so they can propagandize the American people. Some of it they give back to former politicians or future politicians or people that they think are going to help them in the future. They give them jobs, they give them positions, they give them contracts, whatever. Throw some fairy dust on them. And then all that works to control the voters who vote in the senators or congressmen the next election cycle, and the cycle repeats. This is the military industrial congressional complex. They work together. They scratch each other's back. They feather each other's nest. And of course, the voters are the ones that get screwed in this whole thing. They're being propagandized to vote in these. What's needed out of the voters is their votes, and then their tax dollars. And we learned yesterday, even if the spending exceeds the tax revenues, it doesn't matter anymore because we're no longer on the gold standard. We can spend above and beyond our means, which is why deficit spending has become the norm. It used to be the exception. Now it's the norm. So we don't even have to restrain our spending anymore. We just deficit spend. All we have to do is propagandize the right people, pay off the right people, and present it in such a way that this is necessary to keep up with the Joneses. This is necessary if we're going to provide the national security apparatus with all the tools they need to defend our country. And really, it's about defending the empire. Then this tail that's wagging the dog will continue to wag the dog. We need more money, more money, more money. We go into deeper debt, deeper debt, deeper debt. And nobody seems, we're on this snowball rolling. Reminds me of that Merle Haggard song, snowball rolling downhill towards hell. There's going to be a payday someday. And you just can't keep going down this road. But, the people in power today don't care because they won't be in power when payday comes and accountability day comes. How did this ultra-virus get integrated into government? Mainly through three different periods of time. One during the progressive reign of President Woodrow Wilson, when he invited the best and brightest into his war cabinet, basically to run the war effort. And it was supposed to be a temporary measure, but it worked so well. FDR later in World War II is going to do the same thing. And then after Woodrow Wilson, we have those three business presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, where now ultra-virus is literally sitting in the Oval Office behind the Resolute desk. And I put on here a couple of quotes by Coolidge. The business of America is business. The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. And this gave us the Roaring '20s. America, the GDP of America rose more during the Roaring '20s than any other period in our history. Everybody got rich. Not everybody, but a lot of people did. And so until the crash happened in 29, it looked like the stock market would just keep going. It wasn't even considered a bet anymore. It wasn't a gamble anymore. It wasn't risky. You didn't need collateral for loans. Banks would just give you a loan to invest because the collateral will be the stock itself. If it ever goes down, we're in trouble. But it never goes down. It always goes up. And then lastly, you get into President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who came in after the crash. And because of the war, invited the same best and brightest that Woodrow Wilson, he even had the same advisor, Bernard Baruch, invited the same guys in to help run the war effort. And because there was so much money to be made during the war, and this time they decided we're not going to end the war afterwards, we're going to continue, these plutocrats became permanent deep state fixtures. They no longer were transitional figures. They no longer were temporary placements. They became permanent deep state fixtures. And it became the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it became this deep state after World War II. And that's what ran the country in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. That's what ran the country until the Cold War ran its course. And finally ended in 91, 92. And then it became necessary to concoct a new war, the war on terror. And now other parts of the bureaucracy have gotten into the act and realized, wow, we can make money Like the military industrial complex, congressional complex has been making money. We can create other complexes that are outside the area of national security. They can be in term, they can be engaged in public health, for example. That can become the new racket or an equivalent racket. So much so that the new definition of the deep state is not just the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. Now is all the federal bureaucracy and all the industries that feed it. And that's where we are today. All right. That concludes chapter 25 of this series. And what we're going to look at next in part 2 is the making of foreign policy, where these deep staters actually get engaged in running the country, making foreign policy, carrying out covert ops. In the 50s, we're going to look at covert ops where we overthrew other countries' leaders to benefit the private sector and these corporations who, for oil purposes or for sugar purposes or for this or for that. And then in the 60s, we're going to get into domestic targets, people that were trying to put the brakes on this runaway deep state and paid the ultimate price for it, assassinations. We're going to look at Kennedy's assassination. We're going to look at Malcolm X's assassination. We're going to look at, obviously, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy's assassination. That's the 60s. And then we get to the 70s, we'll look at the other president, U.S. domestic target, who became a threat to the deep state and what they did to him, and that is the Watergate scandal. So that will be part 2. And hope you'll join me for that. Until next time, God bless. Thank you.